Welcome to AJP Audio for January 2022. I'm Aaron Van Dorn. In this month's episode, I spoke with Dr. Margert Haney, Director of the Cannabis Research Laboratory at Columbia Psychiatry. We discussed her new review from the January issue of the American Journal of Psychiatry, Cannabis Use and the Endocannabinoid System, A Clinical Perspective. Afterward, I'll speak with Dr. Ned Kalin, Editor-in-Chief of the journal, about the new issue and what ties it together. Dr. Haney, what do we know about how cannabis and its derivative products interact with our brains?
Cannabis is a plant with hundreds of chemical components, and some of them specific to the cannabis plant are called cannabinoids. And the one cannabinoid we know the most about is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC. And that's the one that's been studied, and there are FDA-approved versions of THC. But of course, there are many other cannabinoids that are getting a lot of attention in the marketing of cannabis products that we know very little about scientifically. So the obvious one is cannabidiol. We know a little bit about cannabidiol. It acts very differently from THC. So THC binds to receptor proteins, the cannabinoid CB1 and CB2 receptors. And at the CB1 receptors is where THC is producing most of the effects we associate with cannabis. So the abuse-related effects, the effects on pain, the effects on, mood and appetite, they're all mediated by the CB1 receptor. CBD, by contrast, does not bind very well to the CB1 receptor, and it binds to a lot of other receptors in the brain. So its effects are quite different than THC. And there's a great deal of potential therapeutic role for CBD based on these other mechanisms, but there's so much we need to explore. And, it is very difficult to conduct research with cannabis in humans because of its Schedule I designation by the DEA, which makes conducting randomized controlled clinical trials quite difficult.
One of the main barriers to research in this area is the ongoing federal criminal status of cannabis and many cannabis-derived products. How has the ongoing state legalization changed that outlook?
Well, disappointingly, and to the surprise of many of my friends and colleagues, it has had no impact. So, federally, cannabis is considered Schedule I, which means high abuse liability and no medical efficacy demonstrated. So, heroin and LSD have this classification. When you're working with a Schedule I product, again, federally, you are greatly limited in what you can do. So we have to treat cannabis like it's heroin. We have it in a locked gun safe in a room I get into with my fingerprint. Every remaining component of the plant, after I have people use cannabis in the laboratory, I have to save and return to the DEA. So it's a very restrictive way of conducting research. And you have to have the facilities, which are expensive. We have a designated room and a designated safe and so forth. So many people can't conduct this research. It's also difficult to send people home with product and monitor them over weeks, which is the way you really want to study cannabis if you're looking at its potential therapeutic efficacy. So that's a long way of saying the statewide legalization for recreational or therapeutic use has had no impact on what it is like to be a federally funded researcher, because we have to still treat it, again, like it's heroin or LSD. So it has had no bearing because, again, the federal law trumps the state law. And so, again, we have to operate by the state designation.
Given the rapid changes in state-level laws surrounding cannabis, what changes have we seen at the federal level? It seems like the federal attitude across administrations has been a benign neglect.
I think that's a good way of phrasing it, because actually it's a fairly nonpartisan issue, to be honest with you. I mean, Jeff Sessions had one attitude about cannabis, but overall, it's pretty nonpartisan. There's no political will to clamp down on cannabis right now, none. Every once in a while, so this is all extremely complicated. There is some movement afoot, and the DEA does not seem to want to change the designation. And, it's an interesting conundrum because they argue, well, there's not great evidence for medical benefit, but of course you can't conduct the studies to demonstrate that there's medical benefit. So the DEA, there doesn't seem to be a lot of movement there. There was some effort under the Obama administration to change it, and it didn't happen. So now Congress is taking it on. And as I said, my impression is it's both Republican and Democrat. There's many ways one could facilitate research. One idea is for researchers, classify it as a Schedule II or Schedule III compound. Just loosen the restrictions on studying it. You don't have to change it federally. You can, is there a way that you can free up research to be conducted? The other very complicated component of being a researcher in cannabis is that up until very recently, we've only had one source of cannabis to study. And the good news is that the federal government supplies cannabis and has for 25 years to me, and to other federal researchers. And there's a farm in Mississippi where they can very carefully regulate how the plant is grown, if it has, pesticides or bacteria or fungus, so they can very carefully control the plant product that we administer to research participants. And you want to do that. You, of course, because you have to get FDA approval also to conduct research. And the FDA wants to make sure you're giving a compound that is safe. We can't ever go into a dispensary or find another source of cannabis product, because they're not really terribly well regulated or overseen. There's some regulation, but the FDA wants to know, what you're giving people. They're not going to allow you to give a product that they consider unsafe. So as a researcher, we're very limited to A, the products that we study, and B, to all the regulations associated with Schedule 1.
Is it fair to say then that federal research looking at cannabis products are limited to a very narrow slice of what's going on in a product that has changed significantly in the broader black and gray markets that have developed in the last 20 or so years?
Absolutely. And, there are some researchers who really argue that what we're getting from the federal government is meaningless. And I counter that by saying, it's less potent, but we're still seeing very reliable and reproducible cannabis effects. So I think that a less potent product can still get you, very, very valuable information. But we certainly have no idea about all the other marketing of these other cannabinoids. And we have so again, with this gray market, people selling cannabis, and it's $1 billion industry, can say anything, and consumers feel so comfortable with cannabis that they're very happy to just buy products, Delta 8 THC, or the many other constituents, which marketers are claiming have all these benefits. They may, but I'm not going to believe somebody making money off it to say that it does. We need to be able to study it, and we need to be able to study all these various components, because there is tremendous potential. And there's a very basic research suggesting one cannabinoid or another might have potential for a variety of things. But until we can do the gold standard studies, I really encourage people to have a very jaundiced eye to marketers, because of course they're going to say anything, and there's very few limits on what they're saying. So every once in a while, the FDA will clamp down. They'll say to somebody selling CBD on the internet, stop saying it cures cancer, and so forth. But it's whack-a-mole. They can't keep up with all that's going on right now. It's completely out of control. And as we said earlier, there's limited political will to shut it down.
Has the proliferation of products in the largely unregulated cannabis market due to state legalization helped or hurt research into this area? One of the takeaways from the article and other research recently released in AJP is that the cannabis legalization increases cannabis use disorder. Are there other negative implications?
What I tried to really argue in this paper, and I think is something that is really essential that we study, is what are the consequences of people turning to cannabis for therapeutic indications? And there are, the most common reasons are pain, anxiety, depression. So people are really using cannabis products to treat, pretty serious disorders. But we do not know, and they're using them daily for this. Okay, so as a cannabis researcher, the big focus of my research has been on cannabis use disorder. And this is a drug of abuse. Yes, the consequences are not as severe. When you develop cannabis use disorder, it's not the same as opiate use disorder, alcohol use disorder, but it's still consequential to the individual. Their lives are disrupted. They're uncomfortable with their level of use, and they have a hard time stopping. So the risk of cannabis use disorder is something that I feel is not given much credence or attention, because of course it does pale in relation to other use disorders. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't include it as a potential risk. And in fact, medical cannabis users have higher rates of cannabis use disorder. They do develop an abuse pattern of use with cannabis because they're using it every day. And they're not given probably much warning about this as a potential outcome. So the point I'm trying to make in this piece is, when people are using cannabis therapeutically, for example, and they're using it on a daily basis, what happens when they stop abruptly? There's some very intriguing evidence that if you're using cannabis for pain, as a good example, what happens to your pain when you're using it every day? Does tolerance develop to the analgesic effects? does it develop to the abuse-related effects? What the worst case scenario would be if tolerance developed to the analgesic effects, but not the abuse-related effects. So people are going to keep using more and more and more to try to get to that same analgesic effect. But that may happen, they may not, but we need to study that. So we don't know the consequences of using it daily for these two outcomes, the therapeutic outcome and the abuse-related outcome. But then the other really critical question is what happens when you stop abruptly? And, that's what happens when people go into the hospital. Of course, they're stopping their cannabis use abruptly, and there is some indication that that affects their pain response, for example. This is very anecdotal, and we're hoping to study this question, but the number of people using cannabis raises the public health significance of asking these questions. So you're using it every day. What happens to the abuse-related effects, the therapeutic effects? What happens when you stop abruptly? And what happens to your endocannabinoid system? So we know that using cannabis every day affects your cannabinoid receptor levels, likely affects the endogenous cannabinoids that play a really important role in physiological function throughout the body. So it would make sense that these things would be tamped down when you're using an exogenous cannabinoid, that your endogenous cannabinoid system would adapt. But the consequences of that are not known. So there's so many really, I think, critically important questions we still need to ask, because with the absence of real regulation, people are just gobbling up product by every route of administration and by every potency and concentration. So I just so wish we could know more, to guide clinicians and to guide patients. So, clinicians are faced with questions from patients for which they have no answer, because we don't have an answer. Scientists studying it don't have the answer. So I think it's putting clinicians in a very difficult situation when they don't know what dose, what route of administration, and what the real risks and benefits are.
The entire legal situation surrounding cannabis in this country has become so strange, in large part because of the negative effects are less severe than other substance use disorders, but we've gotten to the point where the market is proliferating while research is much more constrained. It's extremely odd.
It really, really is. And it's complicated by so many things. It is because people are more comfortable with cannabis. It is, for states to be passing laws that go counter to the federal law is just a bizarre situation that we're in. And, it's not good for patients either. People are foregoing FDA-approved medications because they're being sold a bill of goods about cannabis. And again, I'm not anti-cannabis. I actually believe that there's going to be therapeutic potential found for a range of things. But when you forego a cancer treatment, and there's evidence that has happened, or even anxiolytic or other indications for cannabis, you're not being served well either. There's a reason we have randomized controlled clinical trials with placebo, because otherwise we're right back to snake oil salesmen. People believe that this is helping them, and the placebo effect is so real for many of the indications that cannabis is being used for. So where is placebo effect highest? It's high for pain, it's high for sleep, it's high for anxiety, it's high for depression. Placebo response is tremendous. So when you're being told, here is the solution, it's a natural product, and this is going to help you with all of it, why are we surprised that people anecdotally are reporting that it does help? And that's great for them. I don't begrudge them feeling better in any stretch, but this can't be our evidence for it working.
In many ways, cannabis has become quite common in the U.S., both in states that have legalized it as well as where it remains ostensibly illegal. What have we learned about cannabis use and abuse over the last few decades while this societal swing has taken place?
I think the cannabis use has always been quite high, and now there's a level of acceptance with it. So I think that's introducing a new demographic to using cannabis products. I think older people are starting to use cannabis products in a way that they haven't before. So cannabis use disorder, though, which I think is what you're referring to, it's my understanding that the evidence is a bit mixed. There's some demographics that are showing increased rates of cannabis use disorder and others not, with the increased legalization. And I think a lot of it's going to just bear time. We're going to need to wait a little to see what these real consequences of legalization are. But there's no doubt that the level of acceptance has changed. And with that is going to come, the availability and the acceptance around cannabis is inevitably going to increase use. And so therefore a percentage of people will develop a use disorder. And so, I think that is clear. And unfortunately, I don't think the general public is very aware of cannabis use disorder. I think people are still surprised to find out that there's an addiction to cannabis use. And so I think that's a message I would like to get out there for people, because I think the lay public is not entirely aware of it. for a variety of reasons. Withdrawal symptoms take a while to kick in when you stop abruptly from cannabis. It's not immediate like it is with tobacco, cigarettes, for example, or other drugs. So, and as we stated, the consequences of the use disorder they don't drag people down to the same level that other drugs can. So, these are more subtle responses, but it's just not something that anybody wants. If you have a use disorder, you're unhappy about your use. It's almost by definition. And so I think that that's the risk that people have to be made aware of.
What are the next steps for research into cannabis? Given the continued federal level prohibition of cannabis, what are the steps that can be taken right now?
I do not know the answer to that question. I am, plugging away at studying cannabis so I do have the opportunity because I have all the regulatory pieces in place, the FDA, the DEA licenses. So, the thing we didn't mention is even just getting a Schedule I license from the DEA is an extra level. It's not impossible. You can do it, but it's an extra level of regulatory, burden that you have to go through to get it. So I do have all those pieces in place. So it allows me to conduct placebo-controlled trials, which, again, are desperately needed in the cannabis field for the reasons I just mentioned with the placebo effect. I don't know what an individual researcher can do differently. The thing that, again, I think is surprising to people is, so I discussed the cannabis, the one source of cannabis I can get so far. And the DEA has now loosened that a bit. And there is movement now to allow other sources of cannabis for federal researchers. So hopefully that situation is going to get ameliorated a bit. But, CBD, again, getting back to CBD, which is so commonly used and there's, other than its effects on epilepsy, we know really very little in a controlled way. I don't have a source of CBD to even study in the United States. So the one study I did looking at CBD and low-dose THC for the treatment of chemotherapy-induced neuropathic pain, I did, with colleagues here at Columbia, we had to import it from Canada to get a product. Like, there's not even a product in the United States that I could get a FDA approval to study. So, you can imagine the extra expense and, again, regulatory burden to import a Schedule I product. So I see limitations and very little loosening to date on what researchers are able to do.
Research into cannabis right now seems caught between largely unregulated state markets where it's been legalized and continued Schedule I status at the federal level. And politicians at the federal level seem content to let the states run their own experiments, but is there any movement to change the status quo we find ourselves in?
I think that there is, actually. So, I'm involved with an organization, CPDD, the College on Problems of Drug Dependence, and other scientific organizations have really pushed Congress and gone, we've gone to Capitol Hill and really tried our very best to educate Congress on the barriers and how important this is. And so there is movement and there are scientific organizations pushing for this. But yeah, so I am optimistic that there will be some change happening. There's several different things in Congress that are moving through. So I don't think that they're necessarily afraid to touch this topic, politicians, because as I said, they know the majority of Americans are in favor of legalizing cannabis for recreational use federally. So there's very little, in fact, it's hard to argue the opposite in many ways. I mean, there's just the momentum is so strong in favor of legalizing cannabis that it's inevitable. And I don't think any politician is really trying to stop that from happening, to my knowledge. It's not my area of expertise necessarily, but there is movement. I do feel optimistic that something will change. I might be retired by the time it really changes, but I am optimistic about it.
Is there anything else you'd like our audience to consider?
I think it's really important for fellow scientists and clinicians to be aware of the importance of the endogenous cannabinoid system. The CB1 receptors where THC is acting is one of the most ubiquitous G protein coupled receptors in the brain. So the CB1 receptor is everywhere. And the endogenous cannabinoids play this critical role in mood, appetite, anxiety, synaptic development, brain growth, that sort of thing. So the potential consequences, particularly at certain vulnerable times of brain development. So obviously in utero and adolescence are the two primary times that the brain undergoes this tremendous development. And the cannabinoid receptors of the endogenous cannabinoid system is present in the prefrontal cortex and playing a really critical role in this brain development. And so I just think it's important for people to be aware that really heavy use of cannabis in either of these time periods could have potential impacts. So I really am concerned by, again, this cannabis industry promoting the use of cannabis products for pregnant women, because of course it helps with nausea and so forth. And wow, that to me is really a terrible thing. I'm pretty sure psychiatry is concerned with adolescent cannabis use and the potential long-term impact of that on psychosis and other things. But something I do want to emphasize is that this is a really important system we have, and the potential for the exogenous heavy use of cannabis products, particularly at vulnerable time periods, is important.
Dr. Haney, thank you for speaking with us today.
Sure thing.
Next up, Dr. Ned Kalin on the January issue. Dr. Kalin, welcome back to the first AJP audio of 2022.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here for the new year.
What can you tell us about the January issue of the American Journal of Psychiatry?
So we have an issue that starts off the year that is primarily focused on alcohol and cannabis use disorders. And it's a really nice compendium of papers that gets into issues related to the frequency of use of cannabis and cannabis use disorders in veterans. It also gets into looking at the relationship between cannabis use and psychotic disorders. We have a paper that is particularly relevant to eating disorders, showing that if you have comorbid substance abuse with an eating disorder, your likelihood of premature death is markedly higher. And then finally, a large genome-wide association study looking at the genetic underpinnings and heritability of the tendency to consume alcohol and to have problems with alcohol, as well as alcohol dependence, which sheds light on how these different components of alcohol consumption and problems and then dependence are genetically related to each other.
Earlier in this episode, we spoke with Dr. Haney on her review on cannabis.
Yes, she's written a nice review on cannabis that gets into some of the specifics related to the different cannabinoid substances that are available. The endogenous cannabinoid system explains how that works a bit, and then finally talks about how that relates to cannabinoid abuse and its treatment. So that's another nice component of this issue. So, I mean, I think the important thing, obviously, to keep in mind is that substance abuse is obviously very common. It's highly comorbid with all psychiatric conditions or illnesses. Alcohol misuse is very significant and very common. It contributes to premature death in a variety of ways. And cannabis overuse certainly can have significant short-term and sometimes even longer-term consequences. One of the papers by Browne et al. Looks at cannabis use and cannabis use disorder in U.S. veterans. This is a sample from the National Epidemiological Survey on alcohol and related conditions from data that was collected between 2012 and 2013. So the data is a little bit old, but it's before cannabis was legalized for recreational use in any of the states. And so it really looks at sort of the relation between the non-medical use of cannabis and the likelihood of developing cannabis use disorder. And what the investigators found was that in non-medical cannabis users, the lifetime prevalence of cannabis use disorder was estimated to be 17.4%. And the factors that were associated with greater prevalence of cannabis use and cannabis use disorder included being male, being single, younger, having a lower income, and living in a state in which the medical use of cannabis was legalized. In another paper authored by Livne and co-authors, the researchers examined cannabis use and self-reported psychotic disorders. And this was also from the similar sample that we just talked about, but now the investigators assessed the period from 2001 to 2002 and actually compared that from the period 10 years later, roughly from 2012 to 2013 in a quite a large sample. And what the investigators found was that at both time points when they examined the data, that psychotic disorders were more likely to be occurring in individuals that had a past 12 months prevalence of use of cannabis, non-medical cannabis. So individuals that used cannabis previously over the previous 12 months were more likely to develop psychotic disorders, a higher incidence. However, the change is relatively small, or the effect is relatively small. At both time points, individuals with cannabis use disorder compared to individuals that were not users of cannabis, as I said, were more likely to report a psychotic disorder The prevalence difference was around 2.2% in the 2001 to 2002 data and around 2.7% in the 2012 to 2013 data, suggesting that there's approximately a 2% increase in the likelihood of developing a psychotic disorder. What's important about these data is to remember that these in no way are causally related. These are associational data, simply saying that if you've used cannabis in the past 12 months, this is the greater likelihood of you developing a psychotic disorder. And also keep in mind that the assessment of psychotic disorders in this paper were by self-report. Nonetheless, it establishes the association that many clinicians are aware of from the standpoint of cannabis use and increased vulnerability to develop psychosis. In another paper, investigators examined the relation between abusing substances and increased mortality in patients with eating disorders. As I already mentioned, substance abuse is highly comorbid with most psychiatric conditions, and that certainly is the case with eating disorders. And for people that have worked with patients with eating disorders, they know this firsthand. Severe eating disorders have a high lethality rate, both from suicide as well as from the debilitating consequences of poor eating, poor nutrition, and cachexia that can follow. And in this particular study, the investigators, led by Mellentin et al., used a large Danish registry to develop a large sample of approximately 83,000 control subjects that were compared to roughly 21,000 subjects with eating disorders. And what they found was that there was a large effect from the standpoint of increase in mortality for eating disorder patients that had comorbid substance abuse. The likely increase, the risk of increase for alcohol use disorder, comorbid eating disorders, for example, was about 11-fold. When one looks at all types of substance use disorders, in this case, they broke them down into 3 categories. Individuals with eating disorders that had substance abuse across these 3 categories had a mortality hazard ratio of about 23. This is a very, very large increase in mortality and premature death and is clinically very relevant. So one of the take-home points from this particular paper, in addition to these data, is the importance clinically of making sure that we are aware of and understand the magnitude of coexisting substance use disorders in eating disorder patients, and that these substance use disorders and symptoms are concomitantly addressed along with the eating disorder symptoms. And then finally, in relation to the genetics of alcohol consumption and problems, we have a paper by Sanchez-Roig et al. That is the largest GWAS study to date related to alcohol use. In this particular study, which had a total of almost 161,000 individuals, the investigators used a measure called AUDIT, AUDIT, which allows for the ability to look at both issues with consumption as well as alcohol-related problems that individuals get into. And using a variety of statistical manipulations, the authors were able to demonstrate that the genetic underpinnings of alcohol consumption are also related to the genetic underpinnings, to some extent, of alcohol problems. So in sum, this issue, focusing on cannabis and alcohol, provides first a very nice overview of cannabis use and some of the biology that's related to that, and then moves on to talk about some of the factors that are related to developing alcohol and cannabis use problems, specifically in veterans, some of the factors that lead to cannabis use and cannabis use disorders, the association in a large sample of cannabis use with self-reported psychotic disorders and the increased risk, the large effect that was found in relation to increased mortality in patients with eating disorders and comorbid substance abuse, and then finally, in new insights into the genetics and heritability of alcohol consumption problems and dependence.
Well, Dr. Kalin, thank you for helping us put this into context.
That's my pleasure to do it. Thank you.
That's all for this month's AJP audio, but APA Publishing has other podcasts you can listen to. From Pages to Practice looks at the latest research published in the journal Psychiatric Services, hosted by Dr. Lisa Dixon, editor-in-chief of the journal, along with Dr. Josh Bearson. Psychiatry Unbound is the books podcast from APA Publishing, hosted by Dr. Laura Roberts, editor-in-chief of APA Books. Check out these and others, along with APA's newest podcast, Mentally Healthy Nation, at psychiatryonline.org/podcasts, or you can subscribe via Apple, Google, Spotify, or wherever you find podcasts.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the individual speakers only, and do not necessarily represent those of the American Psychiatric Association. The content of this podcast is provided for general information purposes only, and does not offer medical or any other type of professional advice. If you're having a medical emergency, please contact your local emergency response number.